Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. There have been some very late changes to the patch notes for 030. These are substantial, and so I want to quickly go into them in this video. Firstly, we are going to see some very major changes related to the Acrobatics keystone. What are these changes, you might be wondering? Well, Evasion is being redesigned, and everyone is going to get the benefits and the drawbacks of Acrobatics, whether they want them or not. However, the numbers on this are being improved. Let's go into the full details though, because that is just an overview. So let's start with this section on player changes. Player evasion now works on all hits excepting boss skills that have a red flash. So what this means is that a whole bunch of area of effect abilities from monsters that previously couldn't be evaded, they can now be evaded. This is a big buff. There is also a very similar buff that's taking place to block at the same time. However, we also have a drawback associated with this, and this nerf is pretty severe. The evasion formula has been adjusted to lower the percentage of hits that will be evaded by a given amount of evasion. Now, Grinding Games gave us the actual formulas here, both the old ones and the new ones, and some absolute legend has taken an online graphing calculator software and has plotted these three. So, let's take a look at this. This is the formula for evasion in 030. This is the formula for evasion in 020. And this is also the formula for the new deflect mechanic. Which one's which, you might be wondering? Well, I think it's pretty obvious which of these is the best of them. That is the old system, the old formula 020 evasion rating. Green is the new formula. It's quite a bit less generous. And then we have this purple one. This purple one is the new deflect mechanic. Deflect is somewhat analogous to spell suppression from Path of Exile 1, but it's something that you can't get 100% of anywhere near as easily. Now, let's have a quick look into the exact mechanics of how this is going to work. Old evasion rating formula, you're looking against a monster that has 1510 accuracy, which is pretty typical at endgame. Once you got yourself up to 10,000 evasion rating, that monster was being evaded 80% of the time and landing hits on you 20% of the time. With a new system, it's a lot worse. This monster is going to be hitting you about 42, 43% of the time, and you're going to be evading at something like 57%. You're going to need more evasion to get to be as defensively strong against the things that evasion rating used to work on. But at the same time, if you can quadruple your evasion rating, then you'll end up having more evasion than you had with the old system and the acrobatics keystone. So essentially, everyone gets a better version of acrobatics, whether they want acrobatics on their build or not. That is what these changes are. Now, if we look solely at evasion rating, this is probably a net nerf. However, we also need to factor in that there is a simultaneous change that's being made, and that is the introduction of the new deflect mechanic. Deflect is going to reduce damage that you suffer from a hit. It's not quite as significant as it is in spell suppression in Path of Exile 1, where it's 50% or 53% in practice because it's a very easy way to spec into a bit more of it. And you can get more than that, but generally speaking, most people run around with about 53% mitigation for suppression in POE1. Here, it's going to mitigate 40%. Now, essentially what successfully deflecting an attack is going to do, if it's one that was going to one-shot you, it probably won't one-shot you anymore, but you'll still be in an emergency situation. If it's one that wasn't going to one-shot you, but was going to invoke a bit of an emergency situation, then suddenly it's just going to be you're in trouble instead of it being an emergency. And if it was a hit that was going to cause you trouble, but not really an emergency, then that hit will be nerfed to be something that you can pretty much shake off and not really take that seriously. So it's going to be pretty substantial when it procs, and the proc rate on it is reasonable, assuming that you can get comparable amounts of deflection to evasion rating. And ultimately, the amount of deflection that you can get is going to be something we're going to really need to look into. Where I really want to talk about this is the impact on hybrid defenses. So if you're playing a pure evasion-based character that's got some life on it, I think this is actually a fine set of changes for you. There'll be individual fights where you'd prefer the 020 system. There'll be individual fights where the 03 system will be better. And there'll be plenty of things that feel like they're in between where it's pretty much a wash. But if you're playing a character that is using a hybrid of evasion and energy shield gear, there is a real problem here, and that is that when you deflect a hit, I still believe it is going to suppress your energy shield recovery. And as a result, you're going to find yourself in this dicey situation potentially, where you're taking lots of little hits, you're deflecting lots of them, but you're not really able to avoid taking hits for long enough to get your energy shield fully back, and you're at risk of getting whittled down. Ultimately, I feel some of the strengths of the evasion energy shield archetype in the past were that you could potentially just evade 4 hits in a row. And when you evade those 4 hits, or maybe even 7 hits in a row, when you evade those, your energy shield starts fully recovering. And by the time the next one actually penetrates your evasion, you end up back at reasonably close to full ES. Well, with the new system, if you're playing one of these evasion energy shield setups, you might find that you're not evading anywhere near as many hits. You are deflecting them. You might be taking no more damage than you were, but you can wind up finding yourself in a bit of trouble over time. The other thing is we don't know about the availability of deflection rating yet on itemization that is hybrid. So I don't know whether you can get evasion ES gear that has deflection rating on it or not. I'm assuming that you can, but that is definitely not confirmed to the best of my knowledge. Likewise, evasion rating and armor gear, I don't know whether we can get any deflection rating on that either. One final thing, evasion rating and armor kind of don't really have much synergy here. I'm not as negative about armor as a lot of people are in the Path of Exile 2 community. I think it definitely does do more than a lot of people give it credit for in just taking the edge off smaller hits and then allowing you to use the new block, the changed block that exists in 030, which is also getting a reasonably similar treatment actually to what's happening with the forced acrobatics. There's now a lower chance to block, but in exchange for that, you can block everything except for skills that have a red flash on them. So block is being changed as well. Block then causes a bunch of attacks to miss you, and armor mitigates the small ones to the point they barely tickle you, and then you still need a life pool in order to endure the ones that do come through. The big hits that you don't successfully block, you need to have a life pool for that. But that's an entirely different question about how armor is going to work out. The key thing though is that armor and evasion just don't seem to have very much synergy in this system. At least that's my first thought on it. Armor and energy shield, yep, they seem like they may work reasonably well together now, assuming that they're individually strong enough. Energy shield on its own has something going for it. Armor on its own might get there. Evasion rating on its own might get there. But where I'm just a bit unsold on it is when you're hybridizing evasion rating with something else. All that said, we still don't know the passive tree support, and as a result, all of this is subject to change once we get that information. I think it's worth quickly commenting here that when spell suppression was added to Path of Exile 1, it replaced a previous mechanic. Now that mechanic is still technically in the game. You can spec into it, but it's not something many people do, and that was spell dodge. Now with spell dodge, it was something that you would typically try to get 75% of on a build, and then it would be 75% chance to take no damage from a spell, and 25% chance to take full damage. Along comes Suppression, and a lot of characters end up getting built with 100% chance to take 47% of damage. So you're actually taking 88% more damage in the post-Suppression era. Why is it that people felt that this was a buff, not a nerf, to character defenses, and actually is quite a substantial one? The reason was reliability. The reason was that this was just a much more sure defense. And ultimately, that's the potential. If this system with deflection and evasion rating ends up working well, then that's going to be where we are. That said, I'm just genuinely not sure how this is going to work out in practice. A lot of that is going to come down to the availability of deflection rating specifically, whether that be found on gear, whether it be found on the tree. And guess what? We still don't have the passive tree. We still are missing so many of these sorts of things news-wise, which means that we just generally don't know how good these things are going to be. Now, previous versions of the patch notes had a nerf that was listed to the Amazon's critical strike notable. This has been reversed in later versions of the patch notes. That's not because Grinding Gear Games don't think it needs a nerf. It genuinely does need a nerf. It is getting a nerf because it was so oppressively good last season. But that nerf is no longer going to be tied up in the numbers of the actual critical strike notable itself. Instead, that nerf is going to be tied up in these changes to the evasion formula. So with this new evasion formula, it's no longer possible to overcap chance to hit by as much as it used to be, which means that the Amazon notable in question is no longer capable of providing as much additional base critical strike as it was able to in the past. So that's the single highest impact change that's in these patch notes, but there are a few other things, especially for those of you that might have been considering league starting at Deadeye. We'll come to the Deadeye in a sec. Firstly, we've got something about stun buildup. This is a boost to monster stun buildup, but it's not something that's going to have a huge impact. It's only when you've got a shield actively raised or when you're actively parrying. In those situations, monsters have better stun buildup than they had in 020. Now we get to the Deadeye nerf, the first of two. The Thrilling Chase notable passive is getting its benefit halved. The benefits from consuming frenzy charges for your skills have a 50% chance to be doubled, rather than a 100% chance to be doubled. Now, this is one of two things that's going on, because I don't think Grinding Gear Games want this to be everyone play Deadeye League, and it looked like it might have been everyone play Deadeye League. That said, maybe they've gone too far and this will kill the Ascendancy. I'm not sure. I don't think it will. I guess we'll know that for certain 1 week in, once we start seeing what people have been playing so far. In terms of other changes, we have the Acrobatics Keystone passive skill, of course, is being removed because now everyone gets it. And related to this, the Hyrri's Ire unique body armor. This had an effect that was reasonably similar to Acrobatics. That is now no longer needed. And so instead, it's going to provide doubling of your evasion rating if you've not been hit recently. Now, it's worth noting that doubling evasion rating is perhaps not as good as you might think it is. It's still significant, but it's not going to halve the amount of damage that you take. One thing I should add while we're having a quick look back at this formula for accuracy, if you can nerf a monster's accuracy, perhaps by inflicting blind on it and perhaps by investing in blind effect, then you can start seeing that your chances to successfully evade attacks goes up quite substantially. On the other hand, if a monster has unusually high accuracy, then both your chance to deflect and also your chance to evade end up getting worse as a result of that. So some of those monster modifiers that cause that effect, they could end up being fairly scary. 1510 is fairly typical for endgame monsters, but you can definitely play around with this graph if you're interested. I'll put a link to it down in the description below. Now, there are another couple of little changes here. This one's a big one. This one relates to minion damage. This is minions dealing damage against non-unique enemies. This one I think is probably coming up because minions spend a lot of time traveling. They have to spend time walking from one monster to the next, and during that time, they're not really doing very much damage. This isn't a factor when they're fighting something that's super tanky, but when they're fighting something that's a trash monster, well, they're now going to get a boost to the amount of damage they do with hits and elements. This is going to be against non-unique monsters only. It is 3% at skill level 3, which is perhaps not all that much, but this scales up to 50% at skill level 8. The big question though is, does it just stay at 50% more? If it does, this is actually quite a big buff. Alternately, just from the wording here, I can't really absolutely rule out the prospect that it then tapers back down. I guess we'll find out once the servers go live, which is something I'm unfortunately having to say way too often with patch 0.3.0. Other gem changes, Twister is getting a buff. It's not an out of sight buff, but it is a fairly chunky one. And then we have the other nerf that is coming to the Deadeye. So the Eagle Eye's notable passive skill has been renamed to Bullseye. It does something completely different now. And what it used to do was it removed the distance-based accuracy penalty. This was equivalent to getting a tremendous amount of additional accuracy on your character, because beyond a certain point, accuracy for long-range shots is really, really bad. And when you're having a look at this evasion formula, when you end up with a big less multiplier to the amount of accuracy that you've got, well, you start ending up with enemies evading you a lot more. And in fact, once you start having 90% reduction to your accuracy, you're in for a world of hurt trying to hit anything. The old version of the Deadeye had a really good solution to that. The new version of the Deadeye is getting a different node instead, and whilst it's not a nothing node, it's also not anything extraordinary. What this is going to do is it will apply 5 stacks of critical weakness to enemies when you consume a mark on them. Now, this is going to last for 4 seconds by default, unless the game specifies something else. And this is a 2.5% boost to your base critical strike chance. So this is equivalent to your weapon's critical strike chance getting boosted up 2.5%. It's quite good, but this is not something that's extraordinary, especially given the need to reapply the mark. It is worth noting that critical weakness can stack pretty high, and so if you are able to consume multiple marks in a short period of time, you might find there's a big boost for this, but each stack of critical weakness has an independent 4-second duration. After that, there are 2 little changes that are being made to Orb of Storms. Orb of Storms, I'm actually not sure what the patch notes said previously, so I'm not actually certain how substantial a change this is. But the one that is worth noting here is that Snap is going to be worse than it was originally teased as when I was doing my last video discussing the patch notes. Snap now has a 4-second cooldown on it. Now, I still think Snap is going to be good, and honestly, I'm giving serious thought to League starting an Infernalist and making extensive use of the interaction between Snap and Fireball. So Snap is something that can grant me Fire Infusion, and then Fireball does tremendous damage when you've got Fire Infusion already. So that's my first thought at the moment, but ultimately, until people are able to patch the game in a couple hours time, and then we're able to have a look at some of the data mine information that will finally be able to be data mined then, We're not going to know. There is simply no way to plan builds at the moment, which is going to cause grinding gear games a lot of problems because players are going to make a lot more build decision mistakes than they're used to making, and as a result, characters are going to feel worse. Even builds that have been buffed in this patch may end up feeling like they're weaker than they were last patch, and that's going to be entirely because all of the changes to support gems are unknown, all of the changes to the passive tree pretty much are unknown. We can't plan builds, which means we're going to make worse choices than we would have if we were able to plan builds, and that is going to make people feel weaker. Then we're probably going to see a riot on Path of Exile 2 subreddit at some point, and then grinding gear games might overreact by doing something ridiculous like the panic buff of Lightning Spear that they did that pretty much ended up destroying patch 0.2.0. So, not very positive about this whole delay here. I hope I'm wrong about the consequences of this, but ultimately I think that trying to keep things secret for as long as possible is just going to cause grinding gear games a lot of problems and may end up having really serious negative consequences on the league overall. I'm going to leave it there. May Orbs have interesting results. I will see you in 7¼ hours.